The Festiniog Railway was the first narrow-gauge railway to use steam engines and the first to carry passengers. But in the beginning, its only traffic was the local slate.
In the quarry, I found a face, brow and nose and eyes cleft in a stare of 10-year-old surprise. Now the rock is blasted, and the dub chock full of soil and rubble, and the shale carried away in cart and lorry. It's still like cracked reflections in a pool, or image broken in a smithereen of mirrors, or picture jigged and sawn with paste and scissors. The rock face, temple, mouth and all, peers bleakly at me from this dry stone wall.
The slate of Blaenau Festiniog gave birth to the Festiniog Railway. The mountains which tower above the town heralded its beginning and stood as the epitaph to its decline. Since mid-Victorian days, tourists have come to the beautiful Vale of Festiniog in North Wales to ride on the trains. Between 1836 and 1946, there was also a job to be done: to transport thousands of tons of Welsh slate to the wharfs and jetties of Porthmadog for the roofs of the nation's rapidly growing industrial communities. Appropriately, a Welshman started it all, William Alexander Maddox, who was born not in Wales but in London in 1773 of Welsh parents, inherited a fortune, became for a time the MP for Boston in Lincolnshire. Well, he purchased the Taniaracht estate in 1798 and began to reclaim the Avon Glaslyn marshland. Up to 400 men took 3.5 years to build a barrier of stone between the estuary and the Irish Sea. Known to this day as the Cobb, the 1,600-yard embankment is 90 feet wide at its base and 18 feet across at the top. A double-track railway built on the exposed surface conveyed stone for its continuing construction. In 1824, the first quay of Maddox Port, Porthmadog, was opened for shipping. 14 miles away and 1,500 feet above sea level, slate was being torn from the mountains. It was a difficult haul down the rough hillside by sled and cart to the waiting ships. The railway was proposed as the answer. After Maddox's death in 1828, Charles Easton Spooner, son of the route surveyor James Spooner, became the guiding genius of the Festiniog Railway.
The railway was eventually opened on the 20th of April 1836. It was designed from the outset for operation by gravity, that is to say, the trains would make their own way using gravity to get them down from Blaenau Festiniog to Porthmadog. The empty wagons were then to be hauled back up the line by horses, and special wagons were provided on the down-loaded slate trains for the horses to travel in. In the early days, there was one snag to gravity operation, namely the Moylwyn Mountains. The Moylwyn Mountains breached the natural course that James Spooner had surveyed, and for a time it was necessary for the wagons to be hauled up inclines and lowered down other inclines on either side of the mountain. Ultimately, however, the Moylwyn Tunnel was built, linking the two main sections of line either side of the mountain. This tunnel was nearly half a mile long, and the bore of the tunnel was little bigger than the dimensions of the trains themselves. Once steam operation came into effect on the railway, the interior of the tunnel left a lot to be desired from the point of view of both passenger and crew comfort, and it was impossible for anybody to walk along the side of a train should it have become trapped or stuck in the tunnel.
Even after the introduction of steam power, gravity trains continued to roll on the Festiniog. Courageous brakemen kept the swaying wagons under control with handbrakes. The leading brakesman blew a horn furiously as his charge of 80 or more loads of speeding slate rocked and jarred its headlong trip to the sea. Many were the doubters as to the wisdom of using steam engines on a railway with a gauge of only 1 foot 11.5 inches, but the Festiniog's owners proved them wrong. In the 4 years from 1863, 6 locomotives were supplied by George England and Company to a design by C.M. Holland. Only Prince and Princess remain. Princess is a museum piece. Fortunately, her aristocratic stablemate is very much alive and well, and proves it by pounding away from Rue Goch with a heavy load straining her buffer beam. Prince is cared for in the workshops at Boston Lodge, just across the Cobb from Porthmadog. The name of Boston Lodge may not be as familiar as some of the bigger railway engineering halls of fame, but size for size, its claim to fame is just as great. In these workshops, 2 of the famous double Fairleys were built, and to this day the Festiniog's complement of stock is lovingly restored and maintained here. Alan Pegler, the inspiration behind the reopening of the line, was asked whether Boston Lodge was fundamental in keeping the line's fleet of locomotives active.
Well, that's absolutely right. Not only locomotives, but carriages as well, and building from scratch, building new stuff, and of course the restoration of all the wonderful old stuff, because there are a lot of coaches on the railway that are over 100 years old, and they've been completely refurbished, more or less rebuilt in the works. Same way with the locomotives, including the building of a completely new double Fairley locomotive. And that was the first one to be built anywhere in the world for something like 70 years. And to be able to do all that oneself, and even for that matter do a certain amount of outside contract work as well, is something that I don't think any of the other narrow gauge lines are able to do, and it does put us at a very great advantage.
Though surely to look after all these, it must take a great deal of equipment.
Yes, a lot of equipment, and again, some of that certainly was so antique. It was a historical interest and not much else. And over the years, again, there's much better equipment in there for doing work. But nevertheless, tried to retain the character of the old works. And I think on the whole that's worked out pretty well. But certainly they are now able to tackle work that they couldn't tackle in the earlier days. The latest, greatest improvement is being able to tackle all the joinery work in a sophisticated way. And that's another great step forward in being able to restore the older coaches.
Another recent acquisition for the engineering department is a Swiss-made ballast tamping machine, an unusual asset for a narrow gauge railway which makes the job of maintaining the track considerably easier. Once steam power had been established in the early 1860s, the line prospered. During its heyday, 250,000 tons of slate a year were carried. Tourists were beginning to discover Wales, and in 1864 the Festiniog allowed passengers to travel at their own risk. It became licensed as a passenger service the following year, but its prosperity was not to last. The slate trade dwindled over the years, and ultimately the line was abandoned in 1946. The line lay dormant until revived in 1954 by the Festiniog Railway and members of the Railways Society, with Alan Pegler at the helm. Volunteers exhumed the track from the undergrowth until the simplex tractor could blunder its way through to Blaenau Festiniog. It was an incredibly difficult task, as Alan Pegler and John Routley, chairman of the company, explain.
The way it started in '54 is quite interesting, of course, isn't it? I mean, the fact the people who wanted to get it going got hold of you, Alan, didn't they?
That's right, yes.
And then you got hold of me.
Yeah, well, I first came up early in '52, and so my association goes back 30 years plus. And of course, you know, the sight of it to begin with, I mean, it was in a way terrible because it had been let go so badly. I mean, anything in this part of Wales, if it's left to nature, everything grows awfully quickly. And having been left at that stage untouched for over 8 years, it was really quite terrible, the amount that had to be done. And the lower part of the line where the woods are, I mean, there were young trees growing to a height of 15 feet between the sleepers in places, that kind of thing. Quite extraordinary.
But there were two stages, really. One was restoring all that dereliction, which was a fantastic job, done practically entirely by volunteers.
That's right.
Because we couldn't afford to pay anybody in those days. And we went for about a year without any employee at all. We sold scrap that was lying around to pay for anything we needed. We had no income from trains. And after a year, we just restored this bit across to the works, and we ran a train back and forth here and started to generate money, and gradually got more and further up the line, generated more and more passengers. And it's been making steady profits.
The track that the workers uncovered piece by piece forms the longest narrow gauge railway in Wales. From Porthmadog, the line crosses the Cobb, Maddox embankment, to keep the sea at bay. This was the first piece of track to be reopened in 1955. Passing the Boston Lodge Works, it begins its uphill climb. They used to bring dead bodies down from remote farms in the hills to that graveyard in a special hearse wagon. Minforth is reached in 9 minutes by today's trains, though it took the workers another year to restore this far. Here, passengers can interchange with British Rail trains on the old Cambrian Railways line from Barmouth Junction to Pwllheli, which passes underneath the Festiniog's track. The next station is Penrhyn, on the borders of the Snowdonia National Park. From here on, the scenery becomes increasingly spectacular as the trains gain height. Halfway House, 7.5 miles from Porthmadog, is Tanny Bwlch, and here the trains take on water in preparation for the rest of the journey. Linda and her sister Blanche were built in 1893. They spent most of their working lives carrying stone from the Penrhyn quarry to the Menai Straits. They were built by Hunslet, as was Britomart, an 1899 product acquired from the Penny Orseth slate quarry. Since the arrival of Blanche and Linda in the early 1960s, they have become the mainstay of the Festiniog steam power. The passenger's enjoyment is just one of the rewards for the people who run the line. John Routley.
You can't actually tell if you're a passenger which are paid and which are not paid. The volunteers actually take the greatest pride in being as good as any professional. And that's, I think, the satisfaction they get out of doing it, whether they're buffet, car attendants, or working in the works, or cleaning carriages, or being a guard. And I'll tell you one marvellous character. He's a guard, and he is a teacher at Winchester School, public school. He comes here, he sings the names of the stations when he gets out and announces.
Penryn! Anyone for Penryn? Tanagrisai! Anyone for Tanagrisai, please?
And after all, they all have to be trained. We don't let anybody be a guard. They have to start by cleaning carriages, and then they have to work as an assistant guard, and then they have to have exams and practical exams and supervision and passing out before they're allowed to take charge of a train. The same with firemen, locomotive drivers, signalmen, everything you can think of. They're professionally trained volunteers.
Come all young maidens, take warning from me, shun all engine firemen and their company. He'll tell you he loves you and all kinds of lies, but the one that he loves is the train that he drives. I once loved a fireman and he said he loved me. He took me walking into the country. He hugged me and kissed me and gazed in my eyes and said, "You're as nice as the 845. A sailor comes home when his voyage is done. A soldier gets weary of following the drum. A collier will cleave to his loved one for life. But a fireman's one love is the engine, his wife.
In May 1982, a special vintage train was run to commemorate the 150th year since the Act of Parliament which permitted the line's construction. The double-headed 10-coach working is straight out of the history books. The various parts of this unique train have a total combined age of over 1,300 years. At 119 years of age, the locomotive Prince and 2 of the 4-wheel coaches were the train's most venerable components. The youngest, the 3rd 4-wheeler, was only 97. Out in front was Mervyn Emrys, one of Fairlie's 0440 double-ended locomotives, for which the Festiniog is famous. She was built in 1879 in the company's own workshop. Originally, you know, steam for narrow gauge traction was a subject of national debate and considerable ridicule. In the 1860s, the so-called Battle of the Gauges between George Stephenson's widely accepted 4 foot 8.5 inches and Isambard Kingdom Brunel's magnificent 7 feet and 1/4 inch of the Great Western was still in everyone's minds. To the amazement of the detractors, Prince and her sister engines didn't topple off the rails, and they pulled long strings of slate wagons with considerable ease. The rest of the vintage train mirrors the first 2 decades of Festiniog passenger travel. Coaches 3 and 4 carried Great Britain's first paying passengers on a narrow gauge line. They sat back to back, facing outwards on the knifeboard seats. For most of the journey, those facing away from the valley would have seen little but dry stone wall and rock cutting. Number 8 is the last surviving quarrymen's coach. Built at Boston Lodge, it was extremely Spartan. The men provided their own candles and set fire to newspapers for heat, one of the dangerous practices associated with the railway in earlier days, which, surprisingly, caused relatively few accidents down the years. The 4-wheelers are known as bug boxes, and the quarrymen's train earned the title, the Flying Flea. Coaches 15 and 16 were Great Britain's first bogie coaches. Underframes and body frames are wrought iron. Numbers 17 and 18 were constructed 4 years later, in 1876, and have more conventional all-wood bodies with curved waist panels and are known as bow-siders. Number 20 was built by the Gloucester Wagon Company in 1879 and has 2 first-class and 4 third-class compartments. Bringing up the rear are coaches 11 and 12. Now these were built as vans in 1880 and converted in the late 1920s to passenger vehicles. In 1962, number 11 became a first-class observation car with end windows, and number 12 was fitted out as a buffet car with side corridor and through connection. All too soon, the vintage train reaches journey's end at Tanni Grisha. The locomotives run around and snuggle into their carriages for the return trip.
Passengers holding ordinary tickets, please note, this train takes the this train.
At Tanny Bulk, one enthusiast was carried away, but only just. Two and a half hours after leaving, the special simmers quietly across the Cobb to the harbour station. The celebrations are over, and another page in the Festiniog's history is written. The story of the Festiniog is very much the story of the double-ended Fairlies. The design, which Robert Fairlie patented, is an ingenious answer to the problem of building powerful locomotives for steeply graded, winding, narrow-gauge lines. Essentially, there are two engines on one frame. Earl of Merioneth emerged from Boston Lodge in 1979, a completely new engine built to a century-old design. Mike Seymour, Festiniog Society archivist, describes some of the details.
The Fairlie patent isn't necessarily a double boiler. There is also a single boiler, single bogie is under the patent as well. And the fireboxes, you have two fireboxes back to back, two boiler barrels projecting outwards in each direction, and then the steam pipes go from the boiler down through flexible ball joints into the bogie, which is allowed to swivel and has a central bearing just underneath the boiler. There's a central bearing there around which the bogie pivots. And then the exhaust steam, having been used in the cylinders, then goes up through a blast pipe, which again has ball joints in it to allow for the movement of the bogie. The problem in the engine is keeping those joints steam tight. They tend to leak, so the usual sight of a double engine is with a great cloud of steam coming from underneath where the pipes are leaking.
Mervyn Emrys, a legendary Christian bard from the Dark Ages. A study in polished power, Earl of Merioneth is the Duke of Edinburgh's Welsh title, worn with his consent, in Welsh on one side of the engine and in English on the other. The train leaves Tanny Bulk to begin the second half of the journey, clinging to the mountain as the land falls away beneath it. The scenery changes as wooded slopes give way to open moorland. Theact Station became the upper terminus in 1968. A lengthy section of the line between Theact and Tanny Grisha was lost in the waters of a pumped storage reservoir. It took no fewer than 15 years to obtain compensation for the railway's loss. Almost entirely due to the efforts of bands of volunteers, the rails were eventually rerouted through virgin territory behind the new power station, and a new Molewind tunnel was bored through the hillside. To gain the extra height needed, a spiral was constructed at Theact, a method common on mountain lines abroad, but the only one in the British Isles. The building of the new line became known as the Deviation Project, a triumph of voluntary effort, culminating in 1978 when Tanni Grisha became the railhead. Operating a railway of this length is a complicated business, and Terry Turner looks after this aspect for the Festiniog.
Methods of signalling on the Festiniog Railway are exactly the same as on equivalent British rail lines, that is, to the statutory requirements of the Department of Transport. When railways first started, obviously we didn't have any refined equipment such as this machine you see here, and trains used to be signalled very haphazardly on, well, this was the first railway signal, a red flag, and that is all there was to it. It later followed that time interval working, as it was known, was introduced, which basically means they let a train leave a station, and as long as 5 or 10 minutes had lapsed, another one could go and follow it. Bit of a haphazard method. If a train was missing, for instance, they used to send out another engine to find it, and you can imagine the results of that. So it was obvious after a while that we had to find some sort of system that safeguarded the operation of trains. And so began what is known now and still exists today as the absolute block system. This means that a railway is divided into block sections, and in each section only one train is allowed to be at any one time. This was carried out by a simple method of a token. It can be a piece of wood, it can be a milk bottle, it can be anything. But as long as the driver in the section has got this piece of wood or metal or whatever it is, he knew that nothing else would be in the section. And of course this leads to this sort of instrument, which is a more modern version. This is it's known as ETS, electric tokens. And at the end of each block section there's one of these, a pair of matching instruments. This is the Port Maddock token. There's an equivalent one at Minford. Now, for any train to be in this Port Maddock to Minford section, they must be in possession of one of these tokens. You may immediately say, then, if there's only one train, why have we got all these tokens? This is because traffic doesn't always balance itself. You can get 3 up trains and 1 down train, so eventually a lot of these tokens could end up at one end or the other. So, although there can only be 1 token at once, there's about 40 in the instrument. This is wired electronically to the equivalent token instrument at Minford, which means that when a token is out here, you cannot get another one out here or one out at Minford. To work the instrument, we wind this handle here, and you see the indicator goes to clear. There is no other token out. We can then lift this out of the instrument, and there's the token for the driver, which he knows he cannot go without. Now, that being out, a train being in the section, if anybody else tries, they might not know there's another train. We can wind the handle, but you see the indicator has gone to locked. And no matter how hard I try, it's impossible to get another one out of this instrument. So that's the safeguards that the Festiniog and many other railways operate with today, the electric token.
This train terminates, all change please.
Now the slates are no longer needed, the passengers provide the railway's livelihood. Why do they come?
It's in God's own country, isn't it, for a start? It's a tremendous engineering feat. It's historical in its aspects, and it reflects the work of a lot of dedicated members of the Festiniog Railway Volunteer Society and all the others that are associated with it. You know, it's railway preservation at its best, and of course a leading example of it.
You have a beautiful country here, and I think the railroad is quite fantastic.
We love the area, we love the scenery around, and we just like riding on trains.
There's a very similar line that runs in Alaska. It runs from Skagway over to the Yukon. I've heard about these little trains in Wales. They're quite noted in the States, and of course this was one of the attractions that I wanted to find and ride while I was here.
Over the years since 1954, there's been a steadily increasing flow of passengers, from 22,000 in 1956 to over 400,000 in recent years, and many interesting locomotives have been used to haul them. These 3 engines were built during the Great War. Motorway is a Pittsburgh product for a war-torn Europe. Her petrol engine has been replaced with a Gardner diesel, and she's been rebuilt from an 040 to a 240. As Motorway was being put together on one side of the Atlantic, so was Mary Ann on the other. She is an armoured simplex tractor who proved to be an invaluable workhorse during the line's restoration, and to her was the honour of being the first machine in action when the line reopened in 1955. Mountaineer was built by the American Locomotive Company, and her first years were spent wallowing in French mud at the frontline trenches. Following the war, she was acquired by the Tramway de Pithiviers à Toury and only brought to England on the tramway's closure in 1965. Although she still runs on steam, her fuel is no longer coal but oil. Paul Dukes, the works manager, explains why the change was made.
Well, all our locomotives have been progressively converted from coal to oil firing since 1970, mainly born of the reasons that we were causing a lot of forest fires as the forestry moved closer and closer to the line. In those days, of course, it was an attractive proposition on straight fuel costs. Oil was cheap. Nowadays, of course, I think it's straight fuel for fuel costs. There's little to choose between it, but what has got the advantages of oil of better availability, less man time expended in preparation and disposal of locomotives. And of course we have progressively altered and adapted our original equipment to accommodate greater and greater quantities of waste oil, which our kindred associate organisation, the Society, collect for us from a wide variety of sources. We burn about 100,000 gallons of fuel a year in our locos. It's our second biggest single outgoing next to wages. And last year we've consumed nearly 40,000 gallons of waste oil of one sort or another.
2 of the more modern engines on the Festiniog are Mole Hebog, a 1955 Hunslet, and Upnor Castle, a Planet-type engine. She is the line's most powerful diesel with a tremendous turn of speed. She's ex-Admiralty, built in 1954 with a Foden engine, now replaced with a Gardner. Trains are what the railway is all about. Let's just have a look at them in action. People are devoted to the railway in all sorts of ways. The enthusiasts who found the money to rescue it, the staff and volunteers who run it, and the passengers who ride on it. But here's a man whose devotion has taken a different form. Peter Kaiser has recreated the Festiniog's Heyday in miniature. The scale is 009, and nearly all the locomotives and rolling stock are scratch-built from brass and nickel. Every detail is as authentic as possible. The buildings, the railway, and the tiny passengers who ride the trains. The company prides itself on its timekeeping, and passengers always make their connections. Well, almost always. Such was not to be the case one damp morning when the 9:55 slipped and slithered as Linda struggled to grip the greasy tracks. At the act, she had to admit defeat. But at this moment of crisis, the true British spirit revealed itself.
But to be serious, it was just something we wanted to do before lunch. We hope to do it before tea now.
Mountaineer to the rescue. They made it in time for lunch. The excitement of steam travel is surely one of the reasons for the Festiniog's success. But what else attracts the passengers?
One is that it is a most beautiful part of the world to come up into these mountains. The scenery is absolutely out of this world. And, of course, it's a steam railway.
Well, this is it. I think it is the combination of the lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
And particularly when you feel lucky enough to get good weather, my goodness me, there is probably nowhere in Europe that's better.
No.
It is absolutely superb. And for that matter, it has its attraction when it isn't all that superb.
Yeah.
Certainly it's preferable to try and see the scenery from the train than try to drive a car.
That's right.
But the railway, of course, runs through parts where there are no roads within miles. I mean, it's absolutely up on the mountain edge, and it's quite superb.
It is. And, of course, there's all that. Plus, I think the most historic narrow gauge railway remaining in the world. Really. I think it's the oldest railway company in the world.
To have gone on independently without a break.
I think I think it's the oldest railway company in the world now.
The train in the platform is the 12:25 departure to Blaenau Festiniog. Buffet service will be available in the rear 6 coaches of this train. Reserved accommodation for the cream's coach party is in coach 23 to your left as you enter the platform. The 12:25 departure to Blaenau Festiniog is in the station now.
Could I have return to Blaenau Festiniog, please, second class?
That'll be £4.80, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, £5. Thank you.
Today is the 25th of May, 1982, a very special day for the Festiniog. The culmination of 28 years of hard work and dedication is about to be rewarded with the return of the railway to the place which gave it its name. All aboard for Blaenau. At Minforth, more coaches are to be added to carry the passengers on this historic journey. Tanni Grisha, which today has lost its status as the Festiniog's terminus, only another mile. The crowds are waiting. Enthusiasts have come from all over England, a crowd of happy people awaiting the fulfillment of a dream. The Festiniog is back in Blaenau. The railway has come home.